Good. I think we are now going through the magical mark of 50 participants and still rolling in. So I think we are having a critical mass with which we can start. So I'm really happy to welcome everyone to the virtual workshop of the Zurich Carbon Market Association on net zero and negative emissions. My name is Axel Michaelowa. I'm co-founder of the association, long-term president, and work at the University of Zurich and Perspectives. I will first have a short housekeeping announcement. So we will start with the presentations. We have 5 presenters, 10 minutes each. We will record the meeting and the slides will be shared afterwards with all who have registered. I think this is now in the situation where one cannot have live meetings, an important public good to have sharing of information like that. Then I will invite after each presentation oral clarification questions, but purely for clarifications. So you have your virtual hands. Please raise the virtual hand in case you have such a clarification question. But yeah, I would like to have the generic questions dealt with in a different manner. So for the general questions, you have the Q&A function. So please write any general question you have, including your name and the speaker you will be addressing it to, and send it to the organizers. Questions can also be in German language or in French if there are some language issues. So happy to take as many questions as possible. So write them already during the presentation. I will get them. I will then take them up at the very end. What I would really like to ask you not to use the general chat function, because I think it's a nuisance now in the time of virtual meetings that everyone is chatting nicely and freely and no one is actually listening and discussing in the real world. So I would really ask you to refrain from the chat function. I would then, once all the presentations are through, bring in the written questions. If I see a cluster of questions, of course, I will structure that accordingly. And of course, we have 2 full hours for our virtual workshop. And if the written questions are exhausted, I would also invite oral comments. So in the questions, of course, don't embark on lengthy comments, because that I think is not very useful. First, we want to have the discussion and then later the comments. For that, I would then again invite to raise the virtual hands. And of course, I hope that we'll have a really fruitful workshop today. And now I would like to just give a few generic ideas about the topics we are talking about. So the first aspect why we wanted as a Zurich Carbon Market Association to address this topic is that one sees an increasing tendency of net zero as a game changer of the overall climate policy discussion. We have, of course, the wording in the Paris Agreement about the balance of emission and sinks in the second half of the century. But what we see, and this trend is actually accelerating, is the proliferation of net zero targets on really a number of different levels, on the level of entire countries, on the level of cities, and on the level of private sector entities. And this is really a fascinating trend. I must say, I would not have expected it to become so fast. And even in a situation of unprecedented international health crisis, it still continues. Then, of course, for the net zero, we have all the discussions about negative emission technologies. And these negative emission technologies are a very diverse bunch. And I'm really happy that among our presenters, we have people who are working on those firsthand, on both the so-called nature-based negative emission technologies and the technological ones that are based on chemical industry technologies. And of course, there's a lot of debate about the costs, the potentials, and the permanence of these options. What I don't want to have in our workshop today is now a very nitty-gritty technological discussions. For that, of course, one would have probably to have a full week seminar. I would really like to focus on the policy questions, both international, national, and just here on the right hand, you see the small graph about, for example, mitigation costs of the various approaches, but yeah, it's a rich fodder for thought. And then, of course, as we are the Zurich Carbon Market Association, we want to discuss what is the role of net zero and negative emission technologies in carbon markets. So, for example, what should be the role that carbon credits play for entities that have net zero targets? And then also the big policy discussions, those of you who are in Switzerland know, of course, the big debate about the share of domestic emission reductions in reaching national targets. And now there is a new proposal by the government, that one should in the long term use removal credits and that you should use them internationally, whereas there has been a big debate about limiting emission reduction credits. So of course that means we have an increasing tendency to discuss that removal credits are a different bunch. So we want to discuss what are aspects of the current demand for those credits. Do we see, for example, already a price differential? And might these removal credits become eventually the only game in town for carbon markets? So that, like, for example, on the CDM, you saw industrial gas credits actually being shunned by the buyers. In the future, we would see anything that is an emission reduction being shunned by buyers and only seeing removal credits as the basis of international and national carbon markets. So fascinating aspects, and I really hope that we'll be able to address those. And with that, I would now like to introduce today's speakers. So the first speaker is Jürg Füssler from INFRAS. Jürg has been coordinating a very interesting study for the Zurich city and also the state of Zurich about net zero emission pathways. So he will talk about the experiences on this study, which I think is a trailblazer even on a global level. Then we have Hanna Mari Ahonen from Perspectives, who will talk about the Nordic countries and also the entire, let's say, epistemic community of net zero negative emission technologies in those countries and the use of carbon markets. Hanna is from Finland, so she is having first-hand experience, and of course she is a long-standing carbon market player, both from the private sector but also from the government, and now coming back to the private sector at Perspectives. Then our third speaker is Mischa Repmann from Swiss Re. And Swiss Re lately made a very interesting announcement about a huge internal carbon price and an important role for negative emission technologies. So I'm really looking forward to listening to what Mischa has to say, because again, Swiss Re is one of the biggest financial players in Switzerland and the world in the reinsurance industry, of course, is a trailblazer. So looking forward to that. Then we have Christoph Beuttler from a company called Climeworks. Of course, the Zurich community knows Climeworks very well. Actually, the leading company in Switzerland and also, I would say, in all of Europe with regard to the direct air capture technology. So Christoph will talk about direct air capture and also a very interesting approach in Iceland that relates to the permanence of storage in mineralization. And then, last but not least, we will have Natalie Roth, who will talk about nature-based solutions for negative emission technologies. And of course, nature-based solutions are very fashionable these days. And what I really liked about her talk, she will not just talk about opportunities, because many people have very opportunity-oriented views about nature-based solutions these days, but she'll also talk about the pitfalls. So with that, I think we really have a very interesting panel. So I would now give back to Jürg from INFRAS to get the organization to our first talk. So Jürg, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you all for giving us the opportunity to share some findings we made. My role here is the privilege to start with a very local view, from the city and state of Zurich. And I will share a few insights from two studies actually that INFRAS did together with our friends at Quantis and from Perspectives Climate Group. Zurich is the biggest and most economically the most important city of Switzerland, and has been always quite at the forefront for climate mitigation actions, and has now entered into a new phase, so to speak, also triggered by the political activities here, and asked how to get net zero in a short time frame, given the huge city we have here. How can this city reduce its direct energy related emissions to net zero in a short time frame? And we helped the city to do this, and we looked at time frames of 2030, 2040 and 2050. And of course it turned out very ambitious to have such a decarbonization up to 2030. It was also part of a political discussion here. Another question, also very important in that context, is what are the ecological, social and economic impacts of this? And also what approaches and to what extent can further greenhouse gas emission, for which the city is also co-responsible, be reduced as far as possible by 2050. So this is more or less a classical study. We did the first step, what are the city's greenhouse gas emissions right now. You see here particularly the direct energy related emissions, also the more indirect from power usage and things like that. And this has been what the city has done for the last many years. But now the city is also interested in looking what are the indirect emissions, which are huge, particularly in Switzerland, indirect emissions from goods we are consuming, from the energy that is needed for construction materials and so on, and also part and increasingly is looking at what is the impact of the financial center in Zurich on global emissions. So a first step was this inventory, and then we developed different scenarios for reaching net zero emissions by 2050, 2040 and 2030. And you already see here, and the idea is then to use negative emission technologies, this little blue wedge, to counteract, to neutralize the remaining energy related emissions. And the study is also made then in the third step, looking at the entire emissions, including flights, including indirect emissions, the big red part, and also seeing there what role can negative emissions play. Again, we developed many different scenario and also key measures. For instance, in the food related emissions, we assume that it's necessary to reduce the consumption of meat by 2/3 until 2050. So these are quite drastic measures that are in this report, and this only allows them to reduce per capita emissions from 8 to 4 tons per capita, but the direct energy related emissions, they have to go to 0. Vis-a-vis to that, we have here a modest net emission, negative emission technology wedge, and there can be a technical component, also a more nature-based component that should offset at least more than the direct emissions. Now, the second study, and this has been done together with perspectives. There we looked actually at in this overall context for the city and also for the state of Zurich, who also financed this study. We look at what are now the actual options, the technological options, also the nature-based or biological options for negative emission technologies. And this part of the study was carried out by Matthias Honecker and et al. From perspectives, and me, INFRAS, we focused then on the potential role of market instruments. You also have the link here for the study. Here is the main estimation result of perspectives for the different options that they identified for the state of Zurich. Just to mention, the state of Zurich is roughly 1 million inhabitants and doesn't have a lot of industry, so that there is, for instance, no cement industry. Therefore, this option doesn't appear here, but there is some potential. You see here in colors the estimated potential in 1,000 tons of CO2 per year for 2030, 2040, and 2050. And you see, and this is the optimistic, so to speak, scenario. In some options, we also have a lower boundary, a pessimistic scenario with these little black bars. So you see the range is quite big. The most important potential the report sees in carbon capture and storage, in waste in incineration plants, bioenergy and CCS, and also direct air capture has a certain potential. Other options include wood as a building material to store carbon in the buildings, which is not so huge. Then protection of bogs, then soil humus formation, also the application of biochar, and then different weathering options that don't have a huge potential. We have to say that this is a first estimate, so it's more a top-down estimate of the potential, which serves as a basis for the state and the city of Zurich to develop their further strategy. When we look at these different options, in particularly the carbon capture options, we always have like these three main elements, and we have the carbon capture, the transportation of CO2, and also the storage of CO2, and they all bring their own challenges. I want to stay brief here, but I think that's a good overview from the early special report of IPCC. For instance, in capture, different technologies have different characteristics. We have, for instance, the concentration of the CO2 when it's captured, of course, plays an important role. Me as a physicist, I think that's an important relationship. You see direct air capture, where the energy consumption is quite high because you work with a very diluted CO2 gas, whereas if you, for instance, use the flue gases of a waste incineration plant, then the concentration is much higher, and this also means that you have less energy consumption for the capture of the CO2. So there are different aspects that have to be looked at. I think the study overall finds that there is not the one technology that has all the good points. I think we are still in a situation where different options need to be further developed and researched. Transportation is an important part. It can be quite expensive, of course, by pipeline, because we see that the potential for storage in Switzerland being so densely populated, and also given the political situation and the NIMBY effect, makes it quite difficult to store in Switzerland. Therefore, transportation will be important, and also storage has its own issues and risks, because you may have a reversal of the CO2 storage. And coming to the findings of this second study, we see that there is a limited potential for negative emission technologies to compensate for the residual direct emissions to achieve net zero. So there
Jörg, please, 2 minutes left. Sorry.
Okay. I'm fine. Yeah. So we have to. So there is not a lot in terms of potential for nets. Therefore, one has to do all that is possible to reduce and mitigate. The technologies are not yet mature, so there is a need for long-term and stable support and research and development. International cooperation is key, and technical carbon dioxide removal could be more used for compensating direct emissions, whereas nature-based solutions with its permanence issues may be more used for indirect emissions. And it's important to keep targets for emissions and for removals separate. And for the market mechanisms, just briefly, we see a limited role, not least because all countries have now their own targets, and cost benefits of the trading may be limited after, say, 2035. And there is, on the other hand, a clear need for market instruments to trade removal units, because Switzerland will be dependent also on action abroad. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jörg. Are there any clarification questions? If that's not the case, I would just remind those who've joined later that any general questions, please put them in the question and answer function in written form. Write your name, write also whom you are addressing it to, and I will then bring them up at the end after we have gone through all the presentations. And of course, for any oral requests, please raise your virtual hand that I can see it. But I'm not seeing any hand raised right now. So with that, I would thank Jörg and then ask Hanna to come in. Hanna, you have the floor.
Thank you, Axel. Let me put this on the screen. I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, perfect. Go ahead, please.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So greetings from Helsinki, that's where I'm based, and as a Nordic citizen, and I've been working with the Nordic governments and companies for 15 years, so this is a topic very close to my heart. Let me try to get this. No, sorry. Sorry, now I click. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, it is
Yes,
perfect.
we can see it.
Please go ahead.
Sorry, I could just see myself, so that was a bit of a glitch. Here we go now. So the Nordic countries have a very strong and long tradition of cooperation, specifically on environmental issues. For example, they established the Nordic Environment Finance Corporation already in 1990. And last year, they did a Helsinki declaration where they jointly committed to working towards carbon neutrality in the Nordic region. But the idea here is to also lead by example for the rest of the globe to follow. And importantly, to get the business and industry to remain, they're already in the forefront, but remain on the forefront of the green transformation, not only globally, but also not only in the Nordic region, but also globally. And the areas where enhanced cooperation is going to be focused on is catalyzing Nordic solutions all around the world, getting all levels, companies, cities, consumers to start stepping up efforts towards carbon neutrality. And also climate conscious consumerism is important in the Nordics. And there's a broad portfolio of different policy measures in this declaration, and a big focus on incentivizing private sector climate action. And Nordics have been a strong proponent of carbon pricing, both in the Nordic region and globally, and fossil fuel subsidy reform as well. And the declaration also highlights carbon dioxide removal and carbon sinks as an area for enhanced cooperation, including carbon capture and storage, utilization, and mineralization, both on the research side and also on the business model side, both in the Nordic region and again, globally as well. All the Nordic countries have climate neutrality targets set nationally, most of them underpinned by climate acts. And very recently, they've all published sectoral roadmaps to take them to these targets. Norway is the first Nordic country aiming to reach carbon neutrality in 2030, Finland in 2035, Iceland in 2040, Sweden in 2045, and then Denmark in 2050. And some of these targets have an international flexibility element. So Norway will be using international credits in their 2030 targets. Finland will look at international flexibility during their assessment in 2025. And Sweden has a concept of supplementary measures, which includes international flexibility and national removals, which we're going to zoom into next. So Sweden has recently published a strategy and action plan for negative emissions, a very detailed, very long action plan that includes 52 concrete near-term measures for 4 different areas, including information and financial incentives for additional removals in forestry and agriculture. And then in bioenergy CCS, which is very important for Sweden, also in Finland, financial incentives for full-scale commercial projects, and a CCS-backed center to be hosted by the Swedish Energy Agency. And here also international cooperation. So they're proposing the setup of a new program for Article 6, whereby they would buy at least 20 million tons in the next 10 years through Article 6. And part of these would be used towards the carbon neutrality targets, but partly as climate finance, as more of a buffer in case the other removal strategies don't bring them to the pathway. All of these credits would be applied with corresponding adjustments, and initially with a focus on emission reductions, but more and more looking to focus on negative emissions also on these international credits, and using the negative emissions as the carbon neutrality target element and emission reduction credits more as a climate finance. And now at the subnational level, there's also a lot of inspiring examples in the Nordic. Some of the most earliest targets in the world in terms of cities are in Nordic cities like Copenhagen, aiming to be carbon neutral by 2025. Finland has a network of carbon neutral municipalities. And Nordic CEOs are engaging directly with prime ministers to integrate SDGs and Paris goals into business strategies and lobbying very strongly for ambitious EU climate action. At the citizen level, there are some interesting pilots like the one in the city of Lahti, where there's a personal mobility emissions trading pilot going on. And voluntary carbon markets are also looking into nets in Nordics. For example, Iceland, and we'll hear more about it, is there's the sale of DAX credits from the pilot mineralization project. Finland is home to a marketplace for net credits that are already trading at prices from 20 to over 150 euros per ton. And there's a study on the voluntary carbon compensation projects in the land use sector going on as well. In Sweden, the Consumer Agency has been looking at a study on voluntary carbon compensation. Nordic countries have been in the international carbon markets ever since they started for over 20 years. So they have very impressive experience here, and they've also been working individual, but also as the Nordics jointly. And in 2018, the Nordic Environment Finance Corporation, together with Sweden, Finland, and Norway, launched the Nordic Initiative for Corporate Approaches, which brings the Nordic Carbon Market Corporation into the Paris era. And the idea here is to bring the public and the private Nordic actors together to cooperate with their global peers to enhance ambition and go towards carbon neutrality in a way that's consistent with the Paris Agreement framework, specifically the Article 6 framework. So they're aiming to contribute to the development of robust international Article 6 rules, and also through piloting. And besides piloting, there's other activities like studies and technical assistance, including a study by Perspectives on elements of existing carbon credit schemes. And then individual Nordic countries are also working on various Article 6 initiatives. One area is development of Article 6 rules, methodologies, and infrastructure, especially Sweden and Norway, for example, with the climate warehouse with the World Bank on sustainable development aspects, as well as policy crediting, where Perspectives has been providing support with the Global Green Growth Institute. And Perspective has also been supporting the Swedish Energy Agency's very detailed technical work that supports the UN negotiations on Article 6. Sweden's also piloting Article 6 concepts. They have 9 virtual Article 6 pilots, and they're also engaged in the Article 6 support facility and a standardized crediting framework. And finally, Sweden and Norway have budgets to buy ITMOs from upscaled activities through the Article 6 frameworks, through various different facilities. Swedish Energy Agency is also funding a multi-year research project on negative emission technologies, and Perspectives is part of the consortium there. And we recently published a report on the role of carbon dioxide removal in the Paris Agreement. So please have a look. So basically, the Nordics are leading in national net zero targets, and also beyond in net negative targets as well. And the idea here is that by leading by example and doing international cooperation, they're also catalyzing ambition in the rest of the world, so providing solutions that can be scaled up globally. And here they have recognized that nets have a key role, and they're working on nets research and piloting. And also with the very detailed sectoral roadmaps that they've all now published, that's a great, robust basis for developing net zero policies, so something to keep an eye on. Also, the Nordic countries are leaders in international carbon market cooperation, now under Article 6, and previously 20 years with other international carbon markets with the Kyoto Protocol. So they're bringing all that experience into the Article 6 world. They're also rallying very strongly for environmental integrity in the negotiations and in their capacity building, and also through ITMO purchases. So they're creating demand for high quality ITMOs. And so they're certainly punching above their weight in all these initiatives around the world on Article 6 at the moment. And now there is a really interesting opportunity, a Nordic niche, if you wish, to bring these two aspects together so that the Nordics could promote incentives for nets in the context of the EU, and also under Article 6 more internationally, more globally, looking for ambitious host countries that are interested in partnering with the Nordic countries. And we have a strong expert community looking at both of these aspects, and really a great opportunity to bring these two communities together to talk about the combination. So we have the Nordic Networking Group for Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage that's been recently launched. And then we have the Nordic Initiative of Corporate Approaches working on Article 6. So bringing these two communities together would be a very interesting opportunity. And also in the Swedish context, you have the Swedish Energy Agency both hosting the CCS Center, and then also managing the Article 6 initiatives for Sweden. So I can see a clear, interesting synergy there as well. And that was it from my side. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hanna, for this fascinating tour de table around Nordic initiatives. Are there any clarification questions? Again, well, raise your virtual hand if you have any. I'm currently not seeing any hand, so thanks, Hanna. We'll come back to you, of course, in the panel session. So I would now invite Mischa from Swiss Re to take the floor. I hope that this works now. Mischa had some issue connecting earlier, but yeah, I'm hopeful that he'll manage. Perfect. We see your slides.
Perfect.
So
can you see?
Go ahead.
Wonderful.
Yes, everything is.
Thanks a lot.
Fully...
I'm actually on holidays, therefore there were some difficulties. I see into Tuscany a sunset. It's beautiful with olive trees in front of me, helping my parents to harvest the olives. But very happy that I can tell you a little bit how Swiss Re sees the story around net zero and the role of corporates over the next 10 minutes. So let's not lose more time. What you see in my title slide is basically our group COO standing in front of the Climeworks plant in Hinwil. For her, it was really important to see that negative emissions is not just something that some people in her team talk about, and that net zero is something where we should head as a good citizen corporate, but that this is real stuff. So that was very important for the buy-in on that side. Just that this picture is quite symbolic for us. So if we go on, one problem is when we look at this picture here, a lot of people have in mind, so this shows the annual emissions as they evolve over time. It shows you the net emissions path, the purple line that we should be on in order to be at net zero by 2050 and net negative thereafter to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. That's an IPCC figure. Now, it looks here like we need negative emissions after 2050, right? The blue stuff is just there. And before we can reduce emissions, that's not the case because we're walking on the business as usual path. And science is very clear that we will have remaining gross emissions that we cannot abate, that from sectors that are hard to abate or things that we've triggered where we have no control over anymore. So even if we do our absolute best, unprecedented emission reductions efforts, we will have some emissions remaining. And therefore, we need to very early start building up the capacity that brings the negative emissions into the picture. So that's the blue area. That doesn't start at 2050. That starts essentially now, and it needs to scale up to massive amounts, gigatons of negative emissions in and after 2050 that need to be removed. After 2050, also net negative means that we tackle the legacy emissions. So that's the historic emissions that cannot be, tackled anyway differently than by taking them back out of the atmosphere again. Now, if we look at this, it's a problem of scales that people need to be aware. And the management at Swiss Re realized that. So if you take everything that we take from oil and gas, so all oil and gas we get out of the ground and use somehow, that emits 20 billion tons per year today, right? The remaining is coal and land use change. And if you compare the arrow size in and after 2050, if we continue on the business as usual track as we are doing now in the year 2020, that scenario was in the year 2016, 17. So we are doing that, right? So then if we compare the two arrow sizes, the two white arrows here, you see that the exact same amount that we put today from oil and gas out of in the atmosphere, we need to get it out of the atmosphere again. So 10 to 20 billion tons per year. And this is incredible. So there hasn't been an industry that grew from zero to that scale, just a physical scale of the task that industry is supposed to do than the carbon removal industry. So the argument here, or the analog that we can draw, is the carbon removal will be the next trillion-dollar industry, like oil and gas is today. And we believe that oil and gas even plays a very important role there. But we will get in there because they are the ones to know how to store CO2. So what I then tell to our management at Swiss Re is there will be a lot to insure and to invest in if we talk about the next trillion-dollar industry. And that's kind of an obvious case. And it's not only for the insurance industry that this is obvious, but this holds true for many, many industries, if not all of them. So what's Swiss Re doing? Presently, we're focusing on reductions, obviously. In operations, for example, we had been now just this year put in place a lot of actions and measures to reduce our flight activity. On the insurance side, we have introduced policies that restrict us from insuring oil and gas, dirty oil and gas, and thermal coal, for example. And asset management is doing its share with ESG criteria for their investments and green bonds issuing and things like that. In the future, what we need are separate targets for emission reductions on the one hand and removals on the other hand, because we have to do both, do our best and remove the rest. So last year, we managed to get basically everybody committed. Throughout the company, we have now a net zero commitment in operations by 2030 already. On the liability side, so for the insurance products, we signed the UN Business Ambition Pledge for 1.5 degrees. Basically, that says our business model needs to be net zero by 2050. And on the asset side, we have been a founding partner of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance with the same target year. So going forward, say operations knows how to do that task to get to net zero best. We will move from buying carbon offsets as we do today to buying carbon removal certificates in the future. That is basically bringing us as one of the first buyers to the table with the first suppliers of carbon removals, and we can bring our asset managers and our underwriters to the same table. And that gives us an advantage so that also on the business side of this, we can go beyond decarbonizing what we can into the space of negative emissions. So let's focus on operations, which is where I'm coming from. In the past, we had the Greenhouse Neutral program. It started in 2003, and back then it was pretty revolutionary because we decided to offset our emissions. We don't only reduce emissions, but we offset. We start offsetting them, and there wasn't the carbon market as we know it today in 2003, right? So what we did is when we emit 1 ton, we pay somebody else to avoid his or her ton. At the end of the day, which the equation shows in the bottom left corner, we have 1 ton, our original ton, emitted to the atmosphere. And going forward, it's quite obvious that this is incompatible with a net zero target, where we have not only to go down in emissions, but make sure that the remaining emissions are balanced with the equivalent amount of negative emissions. So that's what we have to do in the future. 1 ton we put in the atmosphere because we cannot avoid it yet. We need to pay somebody to remove that ton. Then we are net zero. So the new program is called CO2 Net Zero Program over the next 10 years, with the slogan that you've heard by now, do our best, remove the rest. And the do our best part is covered by, say, we have 2/3 of our operational footprint stemming from flights. Let's tackle our own footprint first there. So we have a -30% reduction target in CO2, not in budget or something, but in CO2 next year. Then we stepped up, as Axel mentioned, our internal carbon pricing policy from some $8 that we used in the past to buy high quality offsets to $100. And this is to our knowledge and quite an intensive research, the first time that an international major company puts out a triple-digit carbon price. Over the time, that price will increase from $100 to $200 because we believe, based on science and the current market intelligence, that by 2030, the cost of the very expensive removals has come down thanks to our own engagement. The cost of the cheap removals, they will go up, and demand side will also play a role. Okay, so we believe that $200 is a fair price for an average, very high quality carbon removal, carbon ton removed by 2030. So our internal carbon price should be there by then. While at the same time, of course, a high carbon price fosters low carbon behavior, low carbon decision making. So our emissions will come down, and we don't have to offset, say, compensate that much by 2030. And the higher carbon price, of course, then allows us as well to buy the removal credits, the high quality removal credits that we have in mind. So we don't want to run to the cheaper options that are now popping up, like monoculture afforestation or other meaningless things to do. We really want to go and buy the good stuff. And this is kind of revolutionary today. Certainly a year ago it was. Currently, you've heard all this discussion. We are a big step forward in terms of thinking towards negative emissions and towards net zero. So quickly into the details, this is the carbon price as we have it put out there, a real levy. So we're going to take that money from our business units and spend it on the removal certificates and on offsets. If we have our group emissions going down at the same time, so emissions times that price gives us a volume of dollars that we can spend on our compensation strategy. And we are designing right now a compensation strategy over the 10 years that allows us, knowing the money roughly at hand, that allows us to enter long-term off-taking agreements. And we believe also based on our experience from the renewables side, that this is what the market currently needs. So this very emergent, nascent carbon removal market, what they need is buyers. And they don't need buyers who go out with RFPs one-off per year. So I have now a volume or some dollars to spend on removals, they need a constant revenue stream over the next 10 years so that they can do this scale up that they are planning to. At the same time, we're not pulling the plug of the high quality offsets, we're phasing them out, right? As we phase in the ramp up the removals, we phase out the high quality offsets such that these projects are not just losing the carbon finance component, but that they can find new financiers. Good. Overall, it's some 50 million that Swiss we committed with that program, and that is just in line with this company Stripe that came out in August a year ago, putting 1 million on the table. Shopify followed with 5. Microsoft put 1 billion in terms of their fund solution, and Jeff Bezos put 10 billions on the table. So you see how the corporates really jumped on that topic. Larry Fink wrote the famous letter to the CEOs that was really also to some degree inspired by Microsoft Smooth, that came basically 2 days apart. And then, of course, many more companies followed with net zero commitments. I have just
so Mischa, 2 minutes to
go. So Swiss Re, we keep our record basically. We check which companies put a net zero commitment out there. And if you have this column in the middle, you don't see it, that's a bit on purpose. Let's zoom in. The column in the middle says, do these commitments that mention net zero include language about removals, about sequestration, about negative emissions? Unfortunately, really more than 50% of those commitments that we have compiled here, they don't. And this is bad, right? This is clearly something that shouldn't happen, that somebody can speak of a net zero target or claim and doesn't get that this means that you need to balance the remaining emissions with negative emissions. So let's keep it there. I think this gives enough food for thought.
So thank you very much, Mischa. Are there any clarification questions? If that's not the case, I would now invite Christoph from Climeworks to take the floor.
Yes,
Perfect.
certainly. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we hear you. Thanks.
Good.
Slides still need to come up. Yes, they are there. Perfect.
Very good. So yeah, thank you, Axel, for putting this important meeting on, and thank you for giving me the time to introduce Climeworks and our mineralization approach. Also, I guess, thank you to Mischa for saving me to explain the first slide, which Mischa has already done much better than I could ever do. So we need negative emissions to neutralize unavoidables and to realize net negatives, and we need to start now. Same message from us. So allow me quickly to say a few words about Climeworks. So we are the first company that is commercial in direct air capture. We have some 16 plants from Iceland to southern Italy. They're modular, so we can build different sizes and build many plants fast and learn quickly. We can run on sustainable energy because we can desorb at 100 degrees Celsius. And that gives us a very low carbon footprint of about 10 for the first generation, 2 to 5% for subsequent plants. And obviously, if you are in the business of removing CO2 from the air, you better don't put more in than you remove. And we constantly striving to improve that, but it's already a very good value. And we also are the first company to supply atmospheric CO2 to customers. So for example, we supply to greenhouses as fertilizer, but also to Coca-Cola for drinks. The bubbles in the drink are CO2. And Coca-Cola Switzerland uses this for their mineral water Valser, and we're super proud that this is in stores today. So it helps us to show that, you know, this works, this is real, we can do this. Quickly going into how our technology works. So it's basically a two-step process. So we have developed a filter that is highly selective and only attracts CO2. And we push a lot of air through that filter. And then once it's saturated, we heat to 100 degrees and desorb it and get around about 99.5 concentrated CO2, with which we can do two things. We can achieve negative emissions, or we can defossilize, so we can replace fossil CO2 for products and materials. And I might go into that if time allows at the end of my talk. So, but since I'm requested to introduce our negative emissions side, so what we have done in Iceland, with our partners at CarbFix, we have developed a methodology where we take CO2 from the air and we use renewable energy from a geothermal power plant to mineralize CO2 underground. And I'm not a geologist, but in very simple words, so if you have the right conditions of porous rock with heat and you need salt water as well, you can mineralize CO2 underground. So it basically turns into limestone, and this is the kind of the safest possible storage one can imagine. So it's safe if an earthquake occurs, or even in a volcanic eruption scenario, this would be gone. So basically putting the CO2 back to where it came from. We're also super proud to announce that we have recently made a technology leap. So on the left, you see Orca, which is, I would say, our second generation of DAC plants, so that they're more space efficient. So, for example, they use 40% less steel per ton of capacity. And we're currently building, we just started building the largest plant we have ever built, which is also at 4,000 tons, twice the amount of our total 16 other plants combined. We realize this is still not huge, but we're scaling quite fast, and we're super proud, and we hope to add one order of magnitude every 2 to 3 years to get this into a largish scale. This is again at Hellshady, where we had our demonstrator, and it's going to commence operation early 2021 if Corona allows. Currently, we are on track for end of Q1. And this is really, I think, getting me into our scale-up roadmap. So I think the past 3 years we have spent creating a niche market, and now we're moving into a scale-up market. We have now a web shop where we sell removals to individuals and companies, and our pioneers, we call them. And for us, the next step, as I mentioned before, is to go into the volume production. So then we aim to build a plant in the region of 50,000 tons per year in 2023, and then add another 0 2 years from then, or 3. So the goal is definitely to become climate relevant, and also obviously, because this is the goal, we keep looking at, can this be done at scale? Do we have enough resources? Is there enough energy? Is there enough storage? And the answer to all of this is yes, it can be developed in time. So this is a feasible option that allows permanent negative emissions. Why is this so important? Why are we not planting trees? So apart from the question of permanence, there's also the question of scalability. And if you were to satisfy in this calculation 8 gigatons, kind of a medium scenario of negative emissions with trees, you would need basically 3 planets of current tree coverage to achieve this. Or if you want to use bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, you need somewhere in the region of the continent, or India as kind of an area of plant coverage to achieve that. There are other things like enhanced weathering, and we hope there will be more technologies to come on, but they're currently not commercial yet. And on the right-hand side, you see that DAC is really very space efficient and has the smallest footprint. And this calculation includes the renewable energy, PV in this case, we need to achieve this. And it's in the region of 98% of the footprint. So it's really small. If we, for example, use wind or geothermal, it can be even made smaller. Maybe if time allows, I quickly want to say a few words about defossilization. So obviously there are very many scenarios where it would not make sense to take CO2 from the atmosphere and bury it underground to neutralize another emission. And one prime example is aviation. So aviation is famously hard to decarbonize or defossilize. There won't be any electric planes soon, at least not long distance passenger. So what you can then do is you can take CO2 from the air, combine it, for example, with green hydrogen, methanize it, then Fischer-Tropsch it, and then arrive at a drop-in fuel that is basically in the region of carbon neutral. And because it is a designer fuel or a synthetic fuel, it also burns cleaner and therefore has further advantages on the climate footprint of aviation. So yes, we can produce negative emissions, but in many scenarios, it's probably better to defossilize, i.e. use renewable energy and CO2 from the atmosphere, to not have to use fossil fuel and thereby not create an emission in the first place. I think what's really, really important is that we keep track of, and I think I saw this also in Mischa's talk, what is a negative emission or what is a closed carbon cycle. And obviously, you know, if you, for example, take CO2 from a fossil point source and you make a fuel out of that, what you do is you reuse it once, but then you create a delayed emission. And the same is obviously true for, I think in the first presentation, I saw an example of waste incineration. So, you know, in the waste incineration plant, you have a biomass part, which can be a negative emission, but you also have fossil CO2 that you are burning. And if you capture that, you don't get a full negative emission, because the fossil part you're just returning back to the ground. So this is ultimately also the reason why, you know, we take it from the air, why we chase 410 parts per million. And I think this also leads us nicely into the policy talk, and you know, us needing really think hard about how we design regulations so they distinguish between CO2 from fossil CO2 from the ground, biogenic CO2, and atmospheric CO2 via direct air capture. And I think,
1 minute,
Axel,
please.
Last slide. So this is what I want to finish with. That's the picture we see. So you know, if we come down in the cost curve, and if we are serious about Paris, there will be a point where, you know, the natural solutions become more expensive than the technical ones. And I think the challenge is to have the technical ones ready at scale before that situation occurs. So with that, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Christoph. Are there any clarification questions from the audience? Again, raise your hand, your virtual hand, if you have a question. I am not seeing, I am seeing Detlef, please. Detlef, you have the floor. Detlef, you need to unmute yourself, please. Okay, well, sorry, but it seems not to work on Detlef's side. So with that, yeah, then I would ask Detlef to write his question in the chat, and I would pass on to Natalie for the nature-based solutions. Natalie, you have the floor. Great, yeah, we see your slides.
Yes,
Perfect.
Good afternoon, everybody, all the participants, and thank you for Zurich Carbon Market Association for organizing this really interesting and timely event, and also inviting me to speak about nature-based solutions and the work that I'm doing in this field, specifically on the coastal areas. So basically setting the scene, we talk about nature-based solutions, and it's important that nature-based solutions are also mentioned directly in the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement Article 5.1 says parties should take action to conserve and enhance as appropriate sinks and reservoirs, and directly refers to biomass, forest, oceans, as well as other terrestrial, coastal, and marine ecosystems. Unfortunately, until a few years ago, we didn't really have a real definition of nature-based solutions, and here IUCN took the lead in 2016 to provide us with a definition of what is a nature-based solution and what makes a good nature-based solution. So here is a definition on a nature-based solution: should protect and sustainably use and manage and restore natural and modified ecosystems, all in an effectively and adaptive way, providing also biodiversity benefits and human well-being, and On top of that, IUCN released this year in 2020 a standard for nature-based solutions, which you can use when you're developing a nature-based solutions project to basically state all these benefits in terms of also biodiversity, net gain, governance, and sustainability. Because we are not only fighting a climate crisis at the moment, we are fighting also a biodiversity crisis. So we have to have a dual crisis on our hand, which are both at heightened stage of emergency, so we need to act. It's also worth to mention that we have from 2020 to 2030 the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So we will see a lot more of awareness raising, capacity building, mobilizing of finance for nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions can come in all forms and shapes. There's a large variety. It can be reforestation, it can be restoration of forest, it can be sustainable forest use. It can also go into ocean fertilization. So we have different kinds of options here. Some are better than others, some are more realistic than others. The carbon markets have been dealing with some of these types of nature-based solutions already in the past. So we have clear afforestation, reforestation methodologies. We have different offsets schemes that are using these standards and that we can work with. Of course, we have the double counting challenge, but it's not today to the right time to go into that. Quickly talking about the benefits of nature-based solutions and the opportunities. We have, of course, with nature-based solutions, multiple co-benefits that come while you're doing nature-based solutions, especially addressing many of the SDG goals, from climate to biodiversity to food security, even water security and filtration. And nature-based solutions often also are very cost-effective mitigation and adaptation solutions. So we studies are finding that about 30% of cost-effective mitigation needed by 2030 can come from nature-based solutions. We have a variety of ecosystem restoration possibilities. I'm dealing a lot in coastal areas, so we work with mangroves, seagrasses, and coastal wetlands. And here you have costs that are around $1,000 per hectare for restoration, which can go up to several $1,000s, and even in some cases very high costs, but the median are around $1,000 per hectare. Of course, for seagrasses and salt marshes, it can be higher, and also for coral reefs. And some ecosystems are more effective than others in storing carbon. The coastal blue carbon ecosystems especially have a potential that's 4 to 5 times higher on carbon storage than terrestrial tropical forests. This is because they are sitting in a wet environment, and degradation of carbon is not so active than in normal terrestrial tropical forests. So the blue carbon science is most developed for mangroves, and mangroves mapping exists. The quantification of carbon in leaf biomass and soils and afforestation methods are well developed and tested already. So there is a potential to generate monetizable offsets, removal offsets, or work through results-based finance to get financing for these ecosystems. Here is just a quick slide. I don't go into it, but it also shows that nature-based solutions, also coastal nature-based solutions like mangroves, have also very cost-effective adaptation. Is also a very cost-effective adaptation measure. And what you have with coastal nature-based solution is often these dual mitigation and adaptation benefits, which makes it very attractive. Here is a slide that shows that also on the level of mangroves, the large nature organizations have worked together and published about 3 years ago a potential map, a map of restoration potential for mangroves, the global mangrove map, where you can go into and look for your site. What is potential for restoring mangroves? What carbon is stored there? What is the value of ecosystem services that the specific area provides in terms of mangroves and ecosystem services arising from the mangroves? I just also want to go into the pitfalls of nature-based solutions. Many nature-based solutions do not store carbon permanently. That's the main challenge. When we talk about removal, we really think about decades and even a century, 100 years, that the carbon should be removed to claim that there's a permanent removal. While nature-based solutions like mangroves, I'm going back there, have the potential to store carbon for a couple of centuries, even thousands of years. Other nature-based solutions on the terrestrial level often store carbon only for a couple of years or maybe 1 or 2 decades. So there is a clear challenge there. We have leakage considerations to look at, and the difficulties to define boundaries of many nature-based solutions projects. Leakage consideration refers to the fact that you are protecting or making afforestation on a specific plot, but at the same time, not far away from where you're doing your removal project, you have deforestation happening in the region. There's also often in nature-based solution projects unclear land tenures and ownership structures, so you need to spend some time on finding who owns the land, who owns the concession, how to get a concession. There are often many stakeholders involved in projects around nature-based solutions, so which means that you often have to work with and through authorities to develop community-based management plans, set up these plans, and this takes a lot of time and effort. There's also a difficulty in setting up nature-based solutions. When I talk now on coastal nature-based solutions, you have to spend some money upfront to do really the carbon potential analysis, the hydrological review of the area, which entails costs in setting up projects, but also costs in monitoring and finding and monitoring the project over a longer time period, and finding also the verifiers that have the experience is quite a challenge. And the other point is, of course, there is an inherent vulnerability of many ecosystems also in light of climate change. We have seen it in Switzerland, where latest study has shown that forests under increasing temperature actually don't absorb as much carbon as we initially thought. We have for coastal ecosystems the threat that sea level rise or increasing storm events degrade mangroves even further, and in addition to normal human stressors and pressures that exist on the ground. Now we have at the moment still the relatively low value of carbon makes that often the areas around mangroves have a difficulty to compete with other uses and other uses that can be much more lucrative. So if you have carbon prices of 5, 10, 15, 20, it's difficult to keep a mangrove restoration, restoration projects up and running for a longer time. So these pressures are important to consider. We have set up together with IUCN and the Luxembourg government a facility called Blue Natural Capital Financing Facility 2 years ago, which really looks into, can we find ways to develop new business models around nature-based solutions, around blue carbon capture and storage, that not only rely on carbon sales, but also really build business models around the ecosystem services that arise from the mangrove. So we look into how to foster aquaculture that have an obligation to regrow mangroves, for example, and basically build them into business models like sustainable tourism, so that you can be ensured that when this activity, that the activity can run for longer periods of time and ensure in this way also some level of permanence. I just want to quickly focus on a blue carbon call that we have launched at the beginning of this year with the Blue Natural Capital Finance Facility. It was in the midst of the lockdown, but nevertheless, we have received about 37 applications for blue carbon projects. We have especially also called on earlier stages blue carbon project, but also we're welcoming later stage blue carbon projects. So 37 applications received, 40% from them have been from sub-Saharan Africa, 30 from Central America, and 20% from Asia. Most of our application came from Mexico, Indonesia, and Kenya. And we have seen that most of the projects had a combination of conservation and active restoration and afforestation. Only 15% of the project had a pure afforestation component, and we have chosen a top. We have made a ranking, and from the top 10 ranking projects, we could. The project developer indicated a generation potential of around 26 million tons of CO2e, but this is over cumulative over 15 to 25 years.
Only 2 minutes, please.
Yeah. Just using the last minutes, basically, to go over the thoughts that we had in determining a good generation potential for tradable blue carbon credits, which we also use in evaluating all the submissions. It's basically looking at the experience of the developer, how far the project addresses the other pressures of degradation in the area. Looking at the legal and regulatory dimensions is important, that land ownership, looking at what arrangements are already in place within the collective management structure of these blue carbon projects. What is the control and enforcement in case we are dealing with protected areas, and governance aspects, looking at which standard are they using. Most applicants seemed to use VCS Vera standards, looking at ESG risks, and looking if also the projects have other revenue streams other than carbon to maintain the longer term sustainability of the venture. And I think I can close with that, and looking forward to hear more.
Thank you very much. So I would now invite the whole panel to switch on your cameras and be ready for the discussion. I have to apologize to Detlef because actually it was our fault that he couldn't speak. So I would now give Detlef the floor for his question, and then I come with the written questions that have accumulated. Detlef, please.
Well, thank you, Axel, and all the presenters for a very good panel, very focused, very high profile. Let me go to the penultimate presentation, and it was about the cost degradation curve for technology for essentially direct air capture and more advanced technologies. What precludes you from making, well, if it turns out, obviously, the low costs are the winner. The question is, what will preclude you potentially from going down the cost curve?
That's a very good question. So we need pioneers. We need, either companies, individuals, or governments who are prepared to spend more now, and to allow us to, expand into a growing market, so we can come down the cost curve, so we can lower capex, opex, and also, lastly, through falling renewable energy costs. This will also be a driver of the cost coming down.
Thanks. So I note that Elina Levina has a question mark. Does this mean you want to raise your hand and ask a question? I'll give you the floor if that's the case. So you need to unmute yourself. It should work now. Please try again. Well, that doesn't seem to work, so I will now get into the questions that were sent through writing. So I have a question from Matthias Honegger to all the panelists that relates to, what are the decision-making tools that we as society need to navigate the necessary transformation and infrastructure investment towards net zero? So especially on the central government level and a roadmap. So would one need, for example, public dialogue processes, expert deliberation, stakeholder consultation, so on? So yeah, who wants to get a stab at that one? Anyone? Yeah, Christoph, please.
Yeah, happy to do so. So I think the topic is now beginning to kind of be very differentiated in the expert field. I think there's still some work to be done with regards to, what is a negative emission, what is permanent, how do the different technologies react. So we need more data. But also I think this applies for policymakers, but also for the general population to a large extent. I think society is not yet aware of where we are with regards to the Paris Agreement goals, and I think what we just described here, especially with the net negative graph, this is not, putting a solar panel on your roof and driving a Tesla. This is a complete fundamental, redesign of our economy, and we need to do it in 3 decades. So I think this might need some public deliberation, and I think it's time this topic gets out into the public and it's discussed on a factual basis.
Thanks, Christoph. Anyone else? Jörg, please, and then Natalie. Yeah, good. I have everyone.
Yes,
So
from the experience in Zurich, of course, this depends always heavily of the local political culture and how things are done. In Zurich, it was clearly the political pressure over the last 2 years, let's say, that helped kickstarting a lot of the things Zurich is now doing, and it's the parliament basically who asked the question how to get to net zero by 2030, 2040 and 2050, which turned out to be a very hard question, in particular for 2030, when you have to do the maths and try to come up with measures that actually reach these targets. In terms of a net emission and negative emission technologies, I think generally it's even harder sales because you basically have to pay and you don't get a lot, in particular if you have these carbon capture technologies, of course, for nature-based solutions there, and the benefits are huge, but I think for Switzerland they make much more sense to do them abroad in developing countries, and there again it's politically more difficult to get the people spend money on this. In the end, I think it's important to have information and awareness raising with the voters, and also the city of Zurich is doing like focus group meetings on specific topics called Climaforum to engage each and every person in the city.
Yeah, thanks, Jörg. And Natalie?
Yes, the infrastructure sector is very key, and integrating net emission technologies in infrastructure is very important indeed. And I just want to mention that on the level of the blue carbon work that we're doing, also with the Blue Natural Captive Financing Facility, we have released earlier this year a full report on blue infrastructure. This blue infrastructure report can be found on the website of the bluenaturalcapital.org. This was a report that we have done together with a number of development banks to show how we can integrate nature-based solutions in coastal development, port development of coastal areas, so that we actually integrated right at the beginning of strategy level, early project development, up to the financing. And we are also planning now with the Blue Natural Capital Financing Facility to team up with an infrastructure fund that invest in projects in developing countries to actually and consistently look at integrating nature-based solutions into these projects.
Thank you. Hanna?
Yeah, I would maybe comment on the types of stakeholders and dialogue that will be needed. I think at least in the Nordic countries, the sectoral roadmaps have been really important in bringing all the sector actors to realize that nets are needed everywhere. And they're needed now and not. I think earlier it felt like it's a future thing we have to worry about in 2040 or whatever. And now it's becoming, because of the ambitious targets, but also because of looking at it closer, that the timelines require action now for them to deliver at the scale that is expected in 20, 30, 40 years. So I think the roadmaps are very useful in bringing the sector integration and bringing all the different sector experts to think about how nets fit into their sectors and across the sectors as well. We can see a lot of cross-sectoral links with the negative emissions. In terms of then the broader awareness raising, I feel that even though the awareness on nets is very high in Nordic countries, it's not really that high in the public discussions yet. It is still thought about as sci-fi, and there is not a distinction between natural sinks that are not necessarily permanent and then negative emissions, and the difference between those two and keeping them separate in the regulation as well. I think there's a lot of awareness raising to be discussed so that people also feel that they're safe and permanent and not sort of scary sci-fi that they are uncertain about. And of course, information takes away that scare. And one thing that really addresses this, and Nordic's already doing it when you have actual pilots, real life pilots that you're showing, and not just a concept, but really showing it. And also interesting is that the voluntary market has also in the negative emissions showing the way and testing and demonstrating. And those first demonstrations have happened to be in the Nordic countries, in Iceland and Finland and elsewhere. And from that, then we can get to, we're still missing the definitions and the accounting rules, and those will be needed. And it would be good to have them harmonized and working together at the Nordic and the EU level, so that then the financial incentives make sense as well. But yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Hanna. I think that was a nice tour de table. Of course, I don't see Mischa. So Mischa, if you want to come in, yeah, please.
Yeah, I can come in by voice, but not by camera somehow. Technically,
yeah, good,
it's muted.
Great. Then you have
no,
the
I would really add one thing, because Matthias asked about decision-making tools, things like that. So I'm here and represent the corporate view, and from the corporate perspective, it's really a pity, and this is addressed to this group as a Zurich Carbon Market Association, that we are not in the position today that we can think of, okay, what's really the role of carbon markets to play here? Where are the facilitators of the transactions that we're going to need? So even the first movers, they are now spending a lot of energy and time in selecting the projects one by one, and then having scientific committees to let them know which ones are good and which ones are not so good, or in line with their view or not. So this is where I see now really that the community here in this Carbon Market Association should step up and help that we get to a place where we have a full-fledged carbon removals market very soon. And that can be, in parallel to the carbon avoidance market still. That I said, it's not the idea to pull the plugs there. It's just that people need to understand, what serves which purpose. And unfortunately, even also in that group here, I can still see, views where people try to protect the old carbon offsets market rather than embracing the new market and see which type of credits serve whom. So this is a very tangible, and then it goes into the whole value chain of a carbon market, right? From the verification of the standard to the whatever. I really, it's from our perspective, it's quite a mess, and people are nowhere. They're kind of taken on the wrong foot. That's how it looks to us.
Yeah, let me come in on this issue, because indeed, of course, we see the first fledgling steps into the carbon market of the removal credits. Like Hanna said, there are some voluntary credits that sell at prices that are completely unconceivable for classical mitigation credits. We see the UK that has said, yeah, we want to shift our carbon market action internationally to removal credits only. We have this Swiss so-called Vernehmlassung, meaning a legal draft comment for an international removal credits for Swiss government. So we have a number of initial thoughts, but that still need to be brought together. And of course, I would hope that, for example, the Nordics, but also governments like Switzerland that are quite eager to do innovative things, actually can convene these initial compliance markets, and that we don't have now a race to the bottom where certain, I would say, simple nature-based solution operators try to sell stuff that used to sell for 50 cents per ton, now for $50 per ton. So I think there's a dire need for bringing in the market to prevent that we have a Wild West situation that destroys the whole concept. But yeah, sorry for coming in as a moderator, but I thought I have some ideas there as well. Now I have a question from Rebecca Les-Kushner to Jürg regarding the scenarios that were used for the Zurich net zero strategy. And she particularly mentions this meat consumption reduction aspect. So yeah, how robust are these scenarios, and what does this, of course, then mean for eventually the negative emissions that we need to bring in? Jörg. You're muted, Jörg, please.
Yeah, I don't think that it makes a lot of sense to go now in this webinar too much into these details. I just wanted to mention that it's actually very hard to get down to levels of residual emissions that are in any way close to levels of removals that one could achieve. And the scenarios look into food, of course, but also, for instance, building energy, and also mobility is net zero is zero in 2050. So this is also a bit so that's clear. That's also easy to do, but we have things like agriculture and also cement production, for instance, where there will be residual emissions. But I invite you to have a look at the slides when they are distributed, and there's also a report. The link is also in the slide, so it's on our website here at INFRAS. You can have a look at it and maybe use DeepL or some translator to get the grasp of the main measures we are proposing there. Or you can also contact me, of course, for further discussions.
Thanks, Jörg. Now, next question is from Matt Spanigal, directed at Christoph. So he says the 4,000 ton per year plant has a 10-year lifetime. So he then calculates back of the envelope $250 per ton of CO2 equivalent cost. So he wants to know whether you try to then prolong the lifetime to periods, for example, of 20 years, or are there specific limiting factors for the lifetime that would keep it at a low level? Christoph, please.
Yeah. So first of all, the back of the envelope calculation is that's in terms of capex is correct, but there's also opex, so it's unfortunately not yet at $250 per ton. So what we do is we like to be conservative. So you know, this is a new technology, and you know, the first of our plants, the demonstrators are now in the region of 10 years. But and obviously in industries like ours, you know, you have plants that are not doing the same thing but have a similar construction that are outdoors and have a lifetime of 20-30 years. That could be, and we foresee it to be longer, but we just try to be on the safe side with our first generations of plants, and obviously, you know, it's better to be safe than sorry. And if it lasts longer, it lasts longer, and we'll keep it switched on.
Yeah, thanks, Christoph. A follow-up question from Matt for the whole panel. So, of course, he says nature-based solutions usually bring in more co-benefits than the ducks or BECCS. But he then mentions the permanence problem, especially in semi-arid areas. So, yeah, he calls it conundrum, permanence versus co-benefit conundrum. So how can we address it? Anyone who wants to take a stab at that one?
Yeah, maybe I jump
Thank
in
you.
because you can see me raising my hand. This is Mischa.
Okay.
Yeah, please, Mischa.
Thanks, Matt, for asking that. I think one misconcept that's still in people's head, those who are thinking about that, and as it was mentioned before, not too many people are thinking about it already. So what we have is a scale problem that I try to highlight, right? And if we have a scale problem, in the end, what we are dealing with is a waste management issue. And unless we understand it as a waste management issue, that currently we dump that waste in the atmosphere where it's causing harm and we have to do something about it, we will always have this thinking around, okay, what's the co-benefit? In my view, and that's a personal view, there are so many good reasons to do all nature-based solutions. Probably the climate aspect is the least important one, right? While there are so many good reasons to think of an efficient waste management technology like ducts, that we should really pursue both, right? And therefore, that's a bit the philosophy that we are following. We are agnostic towards the technology or the carbon removal solution, because we see the good ends at, you know, for both technical and nature-based ones. And we don't want to, you know, play one after the or against the other.
Yeah, anyone else? Christoph, please. Then Natalie.
Yeah, thanks. I also I did forget to say that in my talk. So we at Climeworks, we think we need everything and fast, you know, and obviously mitigation first. So this is not a stab against nature-based solutions, but I don't think we know enough yet to say, oh, you know, nature-based solutions are not permanent and technical solutions have no co-benefits. I think, you know, if you get afforestation wrong, it could have no co-benefits or very little, and if you get direct air capture right, it could have, you know, green jobs, etc., bringing renewables to new places on this planet. And it also could not happen. So what I think is we need to deploy, or you know, start deploying all of these and just learn, because I don't feel we are at a stage where we have full grasp and therefore know how to move forward. The only thing we know is we need to move forward fast, and we need most likely everything.
Yeah, thanks, Christoph, a lot. So for those who are interested in this question of the trade-offs, actually, Matthias Honegger, me and an Indian colleague will have a paper in Climate Policy Journal shortly that looks at the sustainable development co-benefits and impacts of the various nets, and try to really put them into a general framework. So of course, a lot depends on situations, and I agree with Christoph that, for example, for a very remote place with no possibility to sell anything, there, of course, the renewable energy combined with ducts might be having huge co-benefits, so on. But yeah, this discussion will clearly gain space, and within the next month or so, our article will be out in Climate Policy. And Natalie, you wanted to come in.
Yes, exactly. So I think I have to address the permanence question. I also touched upon it in my presentation, and also around permanence, I think it's important that we move towards business models also in the main commodity sectors that integrate nature-based solutions, that set aside land for reforestation and conservation, and that we really fundamentally change the way we do business and we consume, and that nature-based solutions are integrated into every aspect from commodity to infrastructure, so that we build a new world where you have ensured permanence for nature-based solutions. But of course, we are fighting climate change, and some of the ecosystems are more vulnerable to climate change as others. But I think this has to be, we have to scale up the nature-based solutions and work also on more technical net technologies. But these need to go in parallel and over the next decades. And yeah, there is no single fix. So it's a combination of both. And a lot of money is now spent on adaptation, and often when we do now right adaptation and mitigation measures through nature-based solutions, we can also save a lot of money later in terms of emergency relief and relief from disasters. So it's about bringing upfront the money now and having people really also mobilize funding like the Luxembourg government to prepare nature-based solution projects, because we need a big pipeline. There is a big willingness of investors to invest in funds on nature-based solutions, but the pipeline is not ready for the big amounts of investments. And that's the real challenge now, to quickly build up a pipeline. So we took the first step in with coastal ecosystems with the Blue Natural Capital Financing Facility, but the funding from Luxembourg is also scarce, and we look for other donors to join, of course, for the next years. So I invite you to contact IUCN or the Luxembourg government if you feel like on this issue of speeding up basically the pipeline of nature-based projects for negative emissions.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Now we have Elina, and again, sorry, Elina. Jörg, you want to come in? Good. Yes,
may I just come in quickly? I would like just to contradict briefly Mischa, because I don't think that waste metaphor works well, because I think, as you say, you need to be agnostic. Different technologies, but also different nature-based solutions have to be tried out. And because if you look at it as a waste issue, it's basically a cost-only view. And then I think this whole negative emissions technology topic will not take off, because globally there are many countries that can only do nature-based activities, and it's important to have them also on board, and the co-benefits, they are really important and will push this whole topic forward. So I think we need both, and one needs to look at this in a more comprehensive sense, because there will not be so many companies that see a business benefit in spending millions to pay for negative emissions offsets if they don't have to.
No, not yet, I would say, Jürg. I would be careful, not yet, right? And the point is, if we have in many countries the situation where only nature-based solutions work, that could well be, right? And we have also equity questions, so who deals with the rest? Because we need to have 10 to 20 gigatons every year. So it's really a scaling problem that we have.
Colleagues, sorry, I would like to prevent now a discussion that goes across the panel, because we still have a long list of questions. So I would now give the question of Elina. Actually, she has two questions, but they are linked together. So her key question relates to global accounting of removal credits. Given that, CCS, of course, has been undertaken only a few countries, and the potential, of course, is geographically mixed. And her specific question relating to that, of course, also for the Zurich strategy, whether here the Swiss authorities have any thoughts about how to facilitate and manage capture and storage projects that would be part of the Zurich strategy. And of course, this has a wider impact. For example, if we have cross-boundary transactions, then again, of course, global carbon markets like Article 6 need to play a role. So I think her questions really address the heart of the matter, and I would now open that for the question for the panel. So maybe Jürg, you could go into the specific Swiss situation and then these more general considerations regarding global transactions. Jürg?
Yeah, just briefly. Just briefly. This is only in the starting now, and I fully agree that all these regulatory framework, the accounting framework, and so on, that needs to be there. And this is something which can be built up as we go early, so that the systems are ready once we have larger beyond pilot scale activities. But to my knowledge, this is still slow and needs speeding up. Somewhere there was also the question about Article 6 and how this would fit in. How do we deal with corresponding adjustments if there are reversals, for instance, of sequestered carbon? These are very difficult questions and need to be solved. I think it's also important that they are solved in such a way that it does not block the whole activities, because the liability questions would not be solved in a good way.
Thanks, Jürg. Any other thoughts from the panel? Yes, Hanna, please.
I don't know if I have anything useful as a solution, but certainly as a issue to be resolved and piloted as well. And I think because of the international dimensions of negative emission pilots in the Nordics, then this international aspect comes immediately into the picture when, for example, in Sweden, they're planning to do bioenergy CCS and transport it to Norway. So is this captured in inventories? My understanding is that they're not captured in national inventories at the moment, because bioenergy is considered as a zero emission and negative emissions are not recognized by inventories. But then is it the storage country or the capturing country that counts it towards the inventory? It's not something that countries can nationally decide. So it is, I hope that the Nordic countries will start to work with these pilots and develop the methodologies and an accounting in that area, and at the same time in parallel in the EU, because there's the carbon dioxide removal certification mechanism that will start to be developed in the EU, and I'm sure that the accounting and methodologies will be developed in the EU level at the same time. So that's all from my side at the moment. A very important question.
Yeah, Christoph, please.
Yeah, maybe just very briefly. So that the EU is developing a CDR mechanism, and it's to be finished in 2023. So that's already ongoing, and I think several other countries like Switzerland, where the Bundesrat has recently reacted positively to the 1842/11. So they will be thinking about a scale-up roadmap for negative emissions. And Hanna, you mentioned Norway, and there are so many countries now moving on this. And also really in a good way, and so I think there's hope.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Next question comes from Karl Ulrich Gminder to Christoph. So he says, yeah, the land use footprint of the various technologies was mentioned by you, but he also raises the energy footprint. So of course, nature-based solutions, yeah, they usually don't use energy, whereas direct air capture has a significant energy use. How would you react to that?
Yeah, I think that's completely right. And I would maybe add that, the whole thing only works, if we can produce as a species enough renewable energy first to be 100% renewable or near 100% renewable, and then second to produce some more for the negative emissions needed on top. And this is, it's not a choice we have here. We already know we need negative emissions at massive scale. So I think this discussion should evolve around what do we have, what tools do we have, and what can they bring, and how fast can we move and scale and reduce. And I feel that especially the discussion in negative emissions is evolving, that has evolved, you know, probably 10 years ago. We still, to some extent, move around the risks and around, is there enough energy, or are the nature-based solutions permanent? You know, the very fact that we have hesitated so long in climate policy, you know, we know of this problem since 40 years in mainstream policy, at least, has brought us into this. So I think we shouldn't waste time discussing the nitty-gritty. You know, at small scales, most of these solutions have large risks also to energy consumptions. So we can just and should just go ahead and try them all out, and then learn, and then refine our roadmaps, and then go from there.
Thanks, Christoph. So we now have a question from Isa Spiker regarding the monitoring protocols, tools, and systems is in the context of nature-based solutions. So, and I want to add to what Isa is asking. I remember the early days of the CDM, when one of the major arguments not to have avoided deforestation in the CDM was the problems with monitoring and the accuracy of the systems. So, yeah, is the progress on Earth observation systems, satellite data in combination with on-the-ground monitoring now sufficiently robust to actually compare the MRV of nature-based solutions with MRV of classical mitigation? Maybe Natalie, if you could take that one.
Yes, I can take this question, certainly. Well, I can say that over the past years, there has been enormous progress in using remote sensing technologies for monitoring landscapes and monitoring actions on the level of nature-based solutions, looking at deforestation, and also the UN Environment does a lot of work on it through the Land Use Finance Unit, and also others. A lot of this data is also now provided free. Of course, the very close-up data, closer than 5 kilometers, is you have to pay for it still in many cases, but remote sensing has made a huge progress. But you also need to combine the remote sensing with data on the ground, and here we also have, of course, with new technologies like iPads, iPhones, ways to collect data on the ground, and several research institutes also in Luxembourg are looking at citizen science, producing citizen science data, using civil society to come up with closer data on the ground and combine it with remote sensing to ensure easier monitoring of these nature-based solution projects. But of course, it's still a challenge, and it's also a question of costs and how much does it cost. But there's a lot of willingness to make further progress in getting down the cost, while also ensuring a level of accuracy that's needed.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. Any other views on this from the panel? If not, yeah, Jörg, please.
Yeah, just briefly, I think there has been tremendous progress in using remote sensing, but to my knowledge, this has mostly helped to reduce the costs, also to a certain level, to improve accuracy. But I don't see a game changer there. I think still nature-based solutions cannot be measured the same way as you measure tons of fossil fuels. But still, that's not the argument against it. But what we say in the report is that also because of the permanence issue of nature-based solutions, that you may use these kind of projects to offset your indirect emissions from your consumption, for instance, but that you use more carbon capture projects to offset your direct emissions of the residual emissions that you can't get rid of.
Yeah, the next question comes from Tim Reutermann. Of course, well, Tim has been involved in the pioneering Article 6 pilot agreement between Switzerland and Peru that I think was just signed yesterday. So, and Tim asks, yeah, what does one do if one has an Article 6 transaction with an ITMO from a net solution and the net solution turns out not to be permanent? So that would then lead to the risk for the host country to be saddled both, of course, with the liability for the corresponding adjustment and the loss of the storage site. So my answer to Tim, and he directed at me personally. So my answer would be, well, yeah, I agree, that's a risk. Of course, in the past, carbon markets have tried to deal with this through buffer stocks. So, of course, the host country could now ask the developers to bring in buffers, and maybe the mineralization would need zero buffer, because if that's clearly shown that there's a stone and the stone cannot be brought back into the atmosphere, then there would not be any permanence risk. Whereas for the forest, host country, if well governed, would probably then look into what has been the traditional risk of fires, how many % of the forest area have burned down over the period, and what is the risk that climate change makes the fire risk higher. So, of course, we all know that such enlightened governments don't exist everywhere. So indeed, it will be a challenge for Article 6, and we'll have to see which governments are able and willing to, let's say, give an authorization to which type of negative emission technologies. But I would not see it fundamentally different from things that have been done under international carbon markets in the past. One just needs to be fully aware of the risk. Anyone from the panel who wants to add to this question? No, I'm not seeing that. So we have now Franka Bossmann, who asks, are there any efforts to certify net zero claims by corporates? So, yeah, very nice question. Anyone who wants to get?
Yeah, I could chip in here, Mischa.
Yes, please, Mischa, come.
So I would Franka, have your eyes on what SBTi is currently producing. So they released the foundation paper in September. It's been quite a while that they've been working on that, and now that foundation paper on net zero targets for corporates, so a global standard for net zero targets for corporates, that should be released then with COP26 next November. And they have done, the right base work, at least to my interpretation, in my thinking, the way Swiss Re thinks as well. We think it's going in the right direction. There are a couple of things that aren't quite correct, or some glitches in this foundation paper, but they're on very good track. And essentially, it says what I think is in this group here, generally accepted knowledge. You stress first your own abatement, so your own reductions, and then you think of how to compensate it. At the end, when you want to claim net zero, you will have to have compensated your residual emissions by removals, but it doesn't mean that you have to go there from the beginning. Especially, they say, as long as you're not on a science-based reduction path, your whole claiming of net zero, whatever of climate neutral in the past, is kind of obsolete, and you're just in transition to net zero, but you're not at net zero. So it's not enough to just buy 100% of the current emissions as removals and then say, I'm net zero, perfect. So that's read it up. I think it goes in the quite right direction. So to set a science-based net zero target or claim.
Thanks, Mischa. And of course, we have to watch how the SBTi is dealing with this in the long term. We then have the question by Yannick Treris, who asks about to Mischa. The opinion on walking the fine line between pushing removals too early and possibly not achieving the reductions needed because actors hide behind the future prospect of having large-scale removals, which is an uncertain bet. Mischa, what would you say on this question?
Mitigation deterrence is definitely a topic, but it's also mitigation deterrence if we talk about mitigation deterrence. That's what Jen Wilcox said lately in a panel. It's not my quote, but I like it a lot because look, it's the as long as we don't do anything, and as long as it prevents those discussions, those thinking prevents us from doing things, and you know, just producing reports that say we have to do more R&D, that doesn't help to get us any closer to solving the problem. And we know from the old carbon market that there are a lot of pitfalls and flaws. So now we can use that intelligence and design the new removals market accordingly, right? But I agree completely that if you look at it from some angles, so it's funny that CDR or carbon removal is one of the few things that the current administration in the US brings out, right? So really the only bipartisan policy that they do is about removals. And this is because one side looks at it from mitigation, deterrence, cool, we don't have to do anything against coal. And the other says, well, it's a necessity that we're going to use because of the scale. And therefore, I can only invite you to really have this conversation with those who say this is bad and we shouldn't go there because it takes the spotlight from reductions, and say, yes, it does, but we also have to consider the long-term picture of how to mitigate more than 2 degrees warming. And that just includes removals. So the first movers today, they need to think of that. So R&D has to be done, okay. Academia is doing that, believe me, but also, you know, the first mover climate actions takers in the corporate world need to embrace removals and acknowledge their own task to mitigate.
Good. Christoph, Hanna, and Natalie. Christoph, please.
Yeah, just very briefly. So, yeah, I completely agree. There are two forms of mitigation deterrence. But also, again, you know, there are pragmatic solutions. So it's only mitigation deterrence in a net zero scenario. If you define your reduction pathway and you define your CDR scale-up pathway, and you know, I think we have the tools to define them fairly well. Maybe we can add, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5% overlap to be on the safe side. But you know, then we can at least start to move. And again, you know, I would be very much against discussing and researching. We need to move. We have 3 decades, and if we don't want to borrow from the future, we have 1. So yeah, move.
Thanks. Hanna?
Yeah, well, practical solutions exist. For example, the Swedish approach is that they have an emission pathway, and then CDR is used to get to zero, but there's only 15% left in 2045, and not everybody can think that they are in that 15%. So that's where the roadmaps come in as well. And also bringing a little bit of flexibility, but not too much. So Sweden has this limited flexibility with removals if you don't hit your pathway milestones. But there are solutions.
Natalie?
Yes, just quickly to add, my advice would be, as a developer of a nature-based solution project, have a good look at your buyer. Look for buyers who have clear emission reduction pathways aligned with the Paris Agreement, and look for buyers who are serious about good prices for your carbon removal. So if we see prices in the area of what Swiss Re is now offering, of course, this makes it very interesting, and it also prevents, actually, if you have higher prices for nature-based solution carbon removal, it prevents that you forego basically other mitigation reduction options. So good prices, and look at the commitments of your buyer.
Good. I have 2 pending questions, so I hope that you bear with me to run over a bit for a few minutes. The first of the remaining questions is from Jörg Staudenmann, Allianz Süd, and he asked, if the oil and gas industry is to play a key role in carbon dioxide removal, how to avoid they take it a pretext for further drilling and selling fossil fuel while doing double business in making business again with carbon dioxide removal. So yeah, it's a bit follow on the question we had earlier. Christoph, please.
Yeah, again, very briefly, I know the current narrative is around oil and gas have a role to play because they know how to store this, but this is possibly also a role governments could play. And I think, again, you know, that's going into the whole CCUS discussion, which shouldn't exist. There should be either CCU or CCS. You can't unless you find a way to store it in building materials and you count that as permanent, it's very hard to have your cake and eat it. So I think we should, we will need CDR, we will need CCS, and again, to be pragmatic, CCU, so fossil or CO2 to replace fossil fuel should come from the atmosphere, either with bio or with direct air capture, to close the carbon cycle. And so we need to ensure, cradle to grave LCAs and proper rules for this. And then again, there's hope.
Thanks. Anyone else who wants to jump on? Yes, Jörg, please. Jörg, you have the floor.
Yes, I think it's a good question. It may help the transition of these industries, but it may also hinder it, of course. I think a good example is enhanced oil recovery, where you use the CO2 that you put in the ground to get more oil out of. And this has been done in the past. It's a current practice, but of course this should be prevented. And I think this goes back to a set of good rules that would prescribe that the storage of CO2 may not increase, for instance, fossil fuel production by any means. But of course, this will be partially the same companies that do now the drilling for fossil fuels.
Thanks, Jörg. Now we have the penultimate question from Matt Spanigal, who says, he relates to the geoengineering, meaning ocean fertilization. He also mentions mineral weathering and solar radiation modification. So how would one compare direct air capture and nature-based solutions with these forms of geoengineering? So Christoph, please.
Yeah, as someone who also works for a Swiss NGO and has led 2 studies on this, I'll briefly want to comment. So I think we have to distinguish between removal technologies and technologies that try to block radiation from entering our atmosphere. And I think that should be a distinction where we probably could draw the line between geoengineering and carbon removal. And these things also do 2 different things, right? Carbon removal is cleaning up the atmosphere, is hopefully can also remove legacy emissions. And the other thing is basically, might be needed or will very likely be needed if we don't get a move on and don't sort out this mess with the emissions. And then we enter another layer of technologies with another, set of risks and costs and so forth. So I'm not saying we won't need it. The way things are going, we might even, but it's certainly adding complexity to the whole climate goals topic in a big way.
Thanks, Christoph. And
may
but not.
Yeah, one just very short, Axel.
Yeah, please.
I would mention here the biggest geoengineering that we are doing right now is putting 40 gigatons per year of CO2 in the atmosphere. Just keep that in mind. And the second is I don't really want to see us in a world where we start in 10 years from now to talk about CDR deterrence when people swap or move towards SRM, so radiation management. So let's just get the thing done now without talking too much about it.
Yeah, thanks, Mischa. I think this, let's say, deterrence cycle is indeed a problematic feature. And sometimes I feel a flashback to discussions that were held when I started as a young PhD student, to work in the field. So really, the very, very last question comes from Philip from SECO. Should a potential new removal market adhere to the same rules as Article 6 offset markets? Has corresponding adjustment to be undertaken? So that's a very interesting question. Well, I would say a lot now depends on how we define the baseline for this new market. So do we just assume that any removal counts as per 100% of the removal that is achieved. Or would, for example, a government have an NDC that has a net negative target? For example, Switzerland in 2050 may have a minus 10% target. Then I would say definitely at that point in time a corresponding adjustment is needed. So there is a number of interesting questions related to that, which I hope will now be also discussed in the Vernehmlassung process of the Swiss government. Any one of you in the panel who wants to comment on this as well? Yes, Natalie.
Yes, just a quick remark on that. We see many developing countries now in the process of revising their NDCs and looking at ecosystems that have a large storage potential, like the blue carbon ecosystems, and how far they should include them and in the NDCs or not. And inclusion in the NDCs of these ecosystems is closely linked to being able to finance the afforestation, reforestation, the restoration of these ecosystems. So, and this is also refers to what you just said, Axel, about baselines and keeping these systems within the NDC commitment or outside. And yeah, so these are actually very, very urgent thoughts of many developing countries which have good promises for nature-based solutions. They are thinking about it now. And we are helping them, two specific countries, the Belize and the Seychelles on this subject.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalie. I think, yeah, we have run over by almost 10 minutes, but given the virtual technologies, of course, those who had to leave could leave without disturbing the rest. So thank you for a really fascinating evening. I think we had a good tour de table on key issues related to the link of net zero, negative emissions, and carbon markets. I think this will probably not be the last event of the Zurich Carbon Market Association looking into such issues. And definitely it was the best attended event we had in our workshop series. I think we had at one point almost 100 participants. So yeah, I'm really happy that we were able to do it together. Thanks for you attending. Thanks for my co-panelists. And really, yeah, I would like to close the webinar now. Have a nice evening. Bye.